One of the things I think that we need to be wary of is viewing this election um, in a way in which, well, let me rephrase that. I think that oftentimes um, journalists and the media in general have a tendency to um, overlearn whatever previous lessons uh, from past elections or past events. And I think the coverage of this election and the reaction to it is in many ways informed by um, the lessons of 2016. Um, and I think there is a tendency not to view this election as, um, you know, what is happening right now in the moment and the current circumstances surrounding the election. I think that the pandemic and how COVID-19 has played out over the last 6 to 9 months has played a really significant factor in shaping this election, more so than any other event or circumstance or um, organizing or anything else. So I think um, I would be wary of kind of reading into this election too much about what it means for the future of politics and what it means for the left or the right. I think that people should be really wary about any kind of overbroad generalizations or sweeping kind of pronouncements about what this election means for um, uh, the future of the country or the future of politics. I think a lot of what we're seeing now is very specific to this particular time in American history and world history too. So that's one thing. Um, um, but yeah, I have a lot of other thoughts on many other things, but we can get to all that stuff probably.
Cool, cool. So one of the things I'm keen to ask you about is you think that in US politics there's a particular thing which calls itself the conservative movement, which doesn't really exist anywhere else in the world as such. No one in Britain talks about the conservative movement as a thing, for example. And you can date it to the Barry Goldwater campaign in the 60s, and then the Reagan campaign, and you can point to particular institutions, the Heritage Foundation, the kind of anti-abortion campaigns, the NRA, and so on. And what role do you think that conservative movement plays in this election, and what role do you think it plays more broadly in American politics? So what's its function in American politics?
Well, I mean, I think that's a difficult question to answer because I think in some ways the conservative movement um, has played a very critical role in this election and past elections. Um, it is a movement that has been built up over decades. Different scholars and historians point at different um, points in history of when it may have started and the genesis of the movement. You mentioned Barry Goldwater in '64 or Nixon in '68. Others point to Ronald Reagan in '76, and then his election in '80 is kind of the beginning of what's known as movement conservatism. Um, so, and then in the subsequent decades, there was a really massive effort into building a conservative movement infrastructure with organizations like the Heritage Foundation, but also a big part of that movement was bringing in the Christian right into kind of the mainstream conservative movement and marrying kind of the laissez-faire free market capitalism, thinking of the conservative movement with the kind of social conservatism of the Christian right, and bringing those two together, despite when you look at them in a nuanced way, there's a lot of inherent conflicts between those two kind of ideologies. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that has played a big role in our politics and has probably played a really significant role in this election. Although I will say that I think that over the past decade or so, the um, the ideological thinking of within the conservative movement and kind of the intellectual base of the conservative movement has really kind of eroded. You don't have the same kind of robust policy debates or debates about kind of ideology in the conservative movement now that you do have on the left. And so when I look at President Trump and how he has governed and how he has acted as a politician, and you hear this all the time from conservative voters and Republican voters themselves, a lot of them don't really view him as a Republican, right, or as a conservative. There's this phrase now, Trumpism is now a thing. And so I'm not sure how much credit should be given to the conservative movement for Trump versus how much of this is about Trump himself and this kind of cult of personality that has risen up around him. So it's difficult to kind of unpack all this and kind of figure out how much credit to give to who for the success of Donald Trump, and
Potentially today the failure.
What was that?
And potentially today the failure of Donald Trump.
That's true.
Just one other question about that. So another element of that conversation, which I think people in Britain often struggle to understand, is that my understanding is that a fifth of American voters roughly identify as white evangelical Christians. Now,
go ahead.
So, and whether that figure is accurate exactly or not, it's a huge chunk of the American electorate. And so what role has kind of evangelical theology played in the construction of right-wing politics in America?
Well, I'm not sure if that's accurate. If it's 1/5, I'm not sure if the number is right off the top of my head. But I will say it's a significant number, especially a significant part of the conservative Republican electorate identify as white evangelical Christian. But I would say when you look at the Christian right and the kind of social conservatism movement, it's made up of a relatively diverse coalition of white evangelical Protestant Christians, as well as white, although somewhat more multiracial Catholics. You also have Mormons and a few other kind of different denominations of Christianity. And there are some really significant theological differences within that coalition that makes up the Christian right. But I think the theology and kind of politics of the white evangelical Christian Protestants are kind of what make up the main kind of political kind of identity of the Christian right, which is really interesting when you think about the fact that the Supreme Court and achieving a conservative majority of the Supreme Court has been a goal of the Christian right and the conservative movement for a very long time. But now that 6-3 conservative majority, or supermajority, as some people are calling it now, is made up entirely of white Catholics. Evangelical Christians are not represented on the Supreme Court. It's been kind of an interesting to see how that has all played out, and there's lots of reasons for that. But I think one of the reasons I think that white evangelical Christians are so kind of overrepresented, and why their politics drive the conservative movement, is because of the leaders within that movement are all kind of from that particular theology and ideology. There are some prominent Catholics within that kind of movement, but a lot of what drives the movement is driven by kind of leaders from that. So
it's 17%. I've checked the stats of the US population, and I think because they're older than the average, I think it is about a fifth of voters. And so I suppose what I mean is, for a lot of people around the world, the shocking thing last night was quite how many people voted for shocking thing for most people, I can't speak when I'm so tired. For a lot of people around the world, the shocking thing about last night was quite how many people voted for Donald Trump. I think for a lot of people, just trying to get your head around the fact that tens of millions of voters have watched the last 4 years unfold and on balance decided they approved. And I think one of the things that, is very different between America and other kind of, other countries in the global north, is that scale of kind of Christian conservative base, which just doesn't really exist in most European countries, for example. And so I suppose that's what I'm trying to get ahead of my question, is kind of what, how can we help people in Europe and in the UK where I am get their heads around the fact that that is a major chunk of the American electorate and a large part of the phenomenon of the Republican Party and Trumpism?
Well, I think there's a couple aspects to that I think that are important to understand. One, I think, is the degree to which America has been what some people would call, polarized. And I think a more apt description of it might be America has become much more tribalized. I think that's kind of a better way to understand it, and that the politics of demonizing your opponent and viewing their not just ideology and political ideas, but their any kind of political success as illegitimate and fundamentally anti-American in some idea, has been so ingrained over about the last 25, 30 years, really beginning in earnest with Newt Gingrich and the takeover of House of Representatives by the Republicans in 1994, with America and all that. That was kind of what a lot of scholars and political scientists point to as kind of innings of this kind of politics that we're seeing right now. And so there is a sizable portion of the country, of the electorate, that views the other side as not just the opposition, but illegitimate and anti-American, right? And so when you have that view, it's really difficult to kind of support the other side, much less vote for the other side. And I would say with the white evangelical Christians, in particular, and kind of the Christian right more broadly, that movement has been so singularly focused on a few issues, particularly opposition to abortion, to the point where when you talk to a lot of voters who vote for Trump, that is kind of their singular reason for voting Trump. They may express, distaste or for his language and the way he presents himself. They may even revolt at his immigration policy and how he has been caging children and migrants and refugees at the border. But they always come back to abortion and the fact that he has appointed judges that are anti-abortion and that he has pursued anti-abortion policies. That's kind of their single issue. And I think they've had real success at convincing conservative voters that above all else, you can't vote for a candidate if they support abortion rights. And so I think that's really key to understanding why the Christian right has and the broader kind of evangelical electorate has stayed with Donald Trump, is because he has pursued successfully kind of the policies that they value above all else. I think that's the best way to explain it.
My understanding is there was part of the process of the building of the modern conservative movement from, in part white evangelicals and also to some extent Catholics, was quite a conscious construction of a kind of body politic, of a coalition by essentially supporters of the very rich. So, the obvious example is Morton Blackwell, who, founded the Leadership Foundation. As I understand it, in the 70s, described white evangelicals as the new frontier of politics, the new virgin territory into which they could move. And so I suppose, my question is, to what extent is what's going on here really that the, proponents of what I might call neoliberalism, the people who've pushed very hard for a sort of pro-business, pro-corporate, anti-state agenda, worked out that this growth in a particular new religious base was a new place from which they could build support?
Well, this is a project that, business leaders in corporate America has been working on for now more than 100 years. You can trace this project back to the early 1900s with the labor movement then, and because there was a particular focus on delegitimizing what was then known as the social gospel, right? And the idea that Christianity should be used for and push for social justice. There was a move by corporate America to really delegitimize that, and you saw a lot of the beginnings of kind of what we recognize now as these of this kind of politics, beginning really with Truman, or not the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration. The beginnings of really the infusion of religion in politics, I think you can trace back to then. And a lot of that was led by corporate America and these very powerful CEOs that were very influential within the Eisenhower administration. So this is a project that has been really a long time goal of corporate America. So, and I think really when you look at the Christian right, it's not just a political movement, but it's also kind of become almost its own kind of economic movement. And what I mean by that is there's a kind of business that has grown up within the Christian right to create almost a separate economic bubble around evangelical Christians, right? The idea that you can as an evangelical Christian, you can homeschool your children, and have them taught exclusively from evangelical Christian curriculum. You can send them off to college at evangelical Christian colleges. There are entertainment industries that exclusively cater to conservative evangelical Christians. There are businesses of all kinds that may not exclusively do business with evangelical Christians, but that is part of their advertising and market strategies. Companies like Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A come to mind, right? So I think over time you've seen this infusion of evangelical Christianity with kind of market capitalism, and this all seems like the logical result of that. So
I always remember being in Tennessee once and finding a Christian Yellow Pages listing all the Christian businesses in the town I was in Tennessee.
Yeah, I mean and that is not out of the ordinary, right? In many parts of the country, that is kind of really part of the culture, is having kind of a separate economy for evangelical Christians more broadly. So yeah, it's and I think, like I said, it's kind of the logical conclusion of corporate America viewing you know, white evangelical Christians as a potential kind of political movement that they could mobilize. I mean, because for so long there was a long history of thought and kind of teaching and pastors preaching about, you know, the necessity of Christians to kind of not get so involved in politics, right? It was thought that you know, Christians should be focused on the kingdom of heaven, like, and their eternal salvation, and not so much on what they were like, on building kind of political kingdom here, right? That was not kind of really on their agenda yet. And then over time, things changed. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, there's a long history of this. This is not something that is new or even something that's been going on just for a few decades. This has been going on for a very, very long time.
Well, I mean, to get a bit theoretical, the role of non-capitalist institutions like churches and the state and schools and so on has always played an absolutely vital role in propping up the power of capitalism. And that's, you know, kind of, in a sense, the center of Gramsci's thesis about the way that capitalism protects itself is it relies quite heavily on non-capitalist, non-market institutions, and particularly faith, to do that, to preserve power hierarchies, which, you know, of which the market is just one. And so I suppose, in a sense, you know, that's not a new phenomenon. That's been going on.
Well, and this, I think this that goes to another point that I didn't mention, that I think would be helpful for you know, folks that live in the UK and in Europe and elsewhere to kind of understand about this, is there is a deep kind of seated strain of an embrace of authoritarianism within the Christian right and white evangelical Christianity and Catholicism. You know, when you look at the theology and kind of how you know, these different various churches work, and what is being taught there, and how congregants interact with ministers and people of authority within the church, there is not a lot of deference given to like questioning what is being taught at the pulpit, right? There is not a lot of kind of robust debate about what is the meaning of the scriptures.